and today I have a very, very special guest with me, Dr. Robert Epstein. And I'm going to let him give his background. I think he's going to do a better job than myself. But his research, and he's become very well known for it, especially since the 2020 election or just before, is into online manipulation. Obviously, the great focus there would be then Google, and I would assume artificial intelligence as well would be the main focus. So, Dr. Epstein, thank you for joining me. And it's a real pleasure and honor to have you with me. Take it away. Tell us about yourself.
Sure. I've been a researcher for, my gosh, I think about 45 years. Um, that, that number kind of amazes me, but that's true. My PhD is from Harvard University. I was the last doctoral student of a very famous psychologist named B.F. Skinner. And over the years, I've been mainly a researcher, although at one point I was editor-in-chief of Psychology Today magazine. I've published 15 books. Um, about 12 or 13 years ago, I suddenly got interested in Google from a research perspective. Before that, I just thought Google was, a cool and free search engine. That's about all I thought. But for various reasons, I suddenly got interested in them with a critical eye, and I began to suspect that Google had the power to alter people's opinions and attitudes and beliefs and purchases and votes. Uh, I didn't have really strong evidence for that at the time. I had no evidence really, and none of the whistleblowers had turned up. There weren't none of the leaks that later had happened yet. Um, but I'm a very good researcher, so I decided to start to conduct experiments to see whether a platform like Google, a search engine, could have any impact on people's opinions and on their votes. And I didn't think it could have much impact. I thought that, for example, if you looked up a candidate, let's say you looked up right now the two vice presidential candidates. So you just type in the name of
Tim Walz,
one name or the other,
J.D. Vance. Hmm.
right? Wallace or Vance, and if you just type in one name, I thought, well, what if Google was giving you search results that favored Wallace or favored Vance? In other words, what if at the top of the list, if you clicked on whatever they're showing you, and of course we all trust that what they're putting at the top is the best answer. So you click on that. What if it takes you to a web page that makes Wallace look really, really good, or makes Vance look really, really bad? By the way, this is actually what they're showing right now. That's exactly what they're doing right now because we're tracking them. That's another story. We'll get to that. But the point is, I thought, what if they're favoring one candidate over another? What if high-ranking search results made one candidate look really good and the other one look really bad? I thought for people who are already committed, people who have strong feelings, that's not going to make much difference. Um, but how about someone who's undecided, trying to make up their minds? So I conducted what's called a randomized controlled experiment with undecided voters to see whether I could shift their opinions about candidates and their voting preferences. I thought I could shift voting preferences by 2 or 3%. That was my guess. Doesn't sound like much, but in a very close election, that could make all the difference. That could tip it one way or the other. So in that first experiment, where again, I thought I was going to see a 2 or 3% shift, we got a 48% shift. And this is randomized, meaning we got a 48% shift toward whichever candidate we were favoring in the search results. So think of that power. So of course, I thought this was a mistake because that's impossible. So we ran another experiment with another group of people. These were not college sophomores, by the way. This was actually a representative sample of US voters. And we got a shift, I think in the second experiment, of something like 63%. It was even higher.
That's bad
So
news.
yeah, this was early 2013, and I really started to get concerned. We also found that we could mask what we were doing just by mixing up the search results a little bit, and we could mask what we were doing so that nobody had any suspicion that they were being manipulated. No one saw bias in the search results, and we still got these huge shifts. We then did a nationwide study with more than 2,000 people in all 50 states. Again, a huge shift. Um, because that was such a big study, there were a few people, small number, maybe 100 and something, who said they did see bias in the search results. Now, you would think if they could see the bias, that the bias is not going to affect them. That's not what we found. What we found is the people who could see the bias shifted even farther in the direction of the bias. So that was another discovery that was very disturbing, because it means you can't really protect yourself. If Google is doing this, it means they have enormous power to change people's thinking and their votes. Enormous power. What it came down to was we showed in multiple experiments over time, and this work has been replicated, by the way, multiple times over the years. We showed that Google could easily shift, so you want to remember these numbers, between 20 and 80% of undecided voters. Uh, Now, what that comes down to, here's another number we want to keep in mind because it's very relevant to the presidential election right now. What that comes down to is that in an election, obviously most voters have decided, especially when you get close to the election itself. But there's always a portion of people who have not made up their minds, who can still be influenced. And what our experiments show us is that in a national election, like the one we're facing right now, Google can shift between 4% and 16% of the vote with no one having the slightest idea that they have done that. So let me jump today, right to today, because if you look in the swing states to see how much of a margin Trump has or Harris has, if you look right now, you'll find that in 4 of the 7 swing states, and the swing states, they decide the election in this country because of our silly electoral college system.
I
So they
happen to like
decide the
that,
election.
the college system, but
I'm sure
that's another conversation. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
that's another conversation. But whether it's silly or not, whether it's a silly system or not, and Alexander Hamilton, by the way, pretty much invented that system, and he invented it to make sure that nobody like Donald Trump, whom I know you like, but nobody like Donald Trump could ever get elected. That's why he created the Electoral College. It was to prevent it was the electoral college could use their own judgment to override the voters, whatever the voters wanted, because they thought that person was not qualified. So that's really what the system was for. Anyway, the electoral college doesn't have any power anymore. So let me get to my point. Right now, in 3 of the swing states, Trump is ahead by 1 point, possibly 2. In 4 of the swing states, Harris is ahead by 1 or 2 points. So it's very, very close. In fact, and those numbers are, as they say, within the margin of error, meaning you just don't know what's going to happen. That's what the polls are saying right this minute. But I am telling you that if those numbers are reasonably accurate, then Trump has no chance at all of winning the election. Why is that? Because Google can easily shift 4% of the vote, somewhere between 4 and 16%, but 4% is guaranteed. So that if they're neck and neck in those 7 swing states, that means Harris will win all 7 swing states. We know this from now for more than 12 years of very rigorous research. And this is a big and here. Starting in 2016, we started we developed the first systems ever in the world for monitoring the content that Google and other companies are sending to registered voters. So you know how they surveil us and our kids and our grandkids 24 hours a day? They do. It's incredible. We've set up the world's first system for surveilling them. That system in 2016 was pretty small. We've set up bigger and bigger systems over the years. Last year, we finally set up the world's first nationwide monitoring system to look at content that the tech companies are sending to registered voters in all 50 states. We're looking over the shoulders of real registered voters, a politically balanced group of more than 16,000 registered voters in all 50 states, and we're aggregating that data in real time. So if your audience goes to americasdigitalshield.com, that's Americas with an S, digitalshield.com, they'll see a real-time dashboard that's showing you the data that's coming in from around the country. And it's the data are actually showing us what content Google and other tech companies are sending to real registered voters. And it is a absolutely crystal clear picture. They are manipulating, they're doing every single thing they can do to manipulate the vote, and they're doing this 24 hours a day. They're doing it in their search results, their search suggestions, their answer boxes. They're doing it on YouTube. The videos that are being recommended on YouTube, between 70 and 90% of them come from liberal news sources. So they're not being subtle here. They're being very, very aggressive. And right this second, on Google's homepage, which is seen 500 million times a day in the U.S., they're sending vote reminders to Democrats at 2.5 times the rate they're sending them to Republicans. Now that is a absolutely outrageous manipulation. Do you know that on election day alone, if Google is sending out partisan go vote reminders just on election day, that gives the candidate that they like, which in this case is Harris, an additional 450,000 votes just on election day alone. So the bottom line here is Google is using all of these very powerful techniques to shift opinions and votes. That's number one. And in the presidential election, they will shift between 6.4 million and 25.5 million votes to their preferred candidate. Now, as it happens, I happen to like their preferred candidate, Kamala Harris, but I object. I object because what that does, what they're doing is undermining the free and fair election. They're taking away from the voters, from you and me, they're taking away our right under the Constitution to pick our leaders, because we no longer have the power to pick our leaders. Google has been doing this since at least 2012. They screwed up by their standards. They screwed up in 2016. They got Hillary Clinton, in the popular vote, a margin of 2.8 million votes. That's true, but they weren't paying enough attention to the swing states, and Donald Trump won the election because of a total margin of 77,000 votes in 4 swing states. Google just wasn't paying attention. They've been kicking themselves ever since. And one of the leaks from Google, I mentioned leaks a little earlier, one of the leaks from Google is a 1-hour all hands meeting of all Google employees. And one after another, all of Google's leaders get up on stage. This was right after 2016 election. And they say one after another, we're never going to let this happen again.
I remember
We are
that.
never going to let
I
Yeah.
remember that.
And we're going to use our full power and might and influence, and we are never going to let this happen again. And because our monitoring systems by 2020 were getting quite sophisticated, we know that they shifted more than 6 million votes to Joe Biden. Without Google, Trump would have easily won the 2020 election. And he won five in 2020. He won 5 out of the 13 swing states, and that's because of Google. If you take Google out of that election, Trump would have won 11 out of the 13 swing states in 2020, and he easily would have won the electoral college vote and would have become president again. Google has undermined our democracy.
They've eliminated constitutional government overnight,
Correct.
right?
That is correct.
I would say there's a couple of bright spots in this election or any election that right now we may be able to overcome this radical powerhouse that is um, going to give us Kamala, unless my Trump viewers, which would be 99.9% of the 3 to 500,000 people that watch this, would want. And I'm going to say two things. One, I think that the years of Google search manipulation has done its job well, because people don't exist as victims of manipulation just discreetly during an election period. So the bias that we see, well, the bias that they've been able to achieve in 2012, they missed it in 2016, 2022, upcoming 24. They've been working on this same population, generally speaking, all of these years. I'm just trying to give a bright spot of hope. That's all. Um, so they've already moved people in the Kamala camp prior to get out the vote, right? So the numbers that we're seeing right now, they may not be able to shift it as much with their get out the vote from where we are today, because they've already shifted hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people into the Democrat Party basket, as long as RFK wasn't in there, but in the Democrat bucket. Um, and so maybe they've already realized that gain and they just can't get it over the hump so that it's a clear victory pre-election day. Do you see? Am I explaining my
You're
proposal?
explaining yourself very, very clearly now. Now I'm going to explain to you why.
I didn't put get out the
Um,
vote yet. Let me just say this then. Some
sure.
people, like 18-year-old college girls or whatever, they don't have to be in college, may not vote. They talk a big talk. They go um, to their anti-Jewish rallies, and they're all for Hamas, but they're just not going to vote because they're not acculturated to that yet. They're not old enough to care enough to get off their couch and go. So I can be hopeful for that. And what I'm saying is the get out the vote may not, it may switch how those people think, but it may not actually result in those people getting off the couch, getting in the car, and going to their local library or school district. So take it away, tear that down.
Sure. Okay. Uh, First of all, you're right. You're correct. But still, at any point in time, there are millions of people, millions, who still haven't made up their mind, or who are still can be influenced. They can be pushed. They can be nudged. We have the word nudge. There's nudge and then there's nudge. They're a little different. But the point is, there are people who can be nudged. And guess what? You and I don't know who exactly they are. We might have some friends who are in that category. But Google knows exactly who those people are, because Google is reading everyone's emails and looking at all their online searches and looking at who they donate to. And Google Docs, and they're also keeping track of all our locations at all times, so they know if we attend a rally, if we don't attend a rally. They know exactly who the people are who can still be influenced, which you and I don't know, they know. And they can use all of these techniques that we've discovered over the years, all of them, not just go vote reminders, but they do, not just that they can, they do manipulate the recommendations they make on YouTube, for example. And 18-year-olds are very, very vulnerable to that kind of manipulation. 70% of the videos people watch on YouTube are recommended by Google's algorithm. For kids under 18, it goes up to about 90% are recommended by Google's algorithm. And then there's the answer boxes and the search results and search suggestions and more, news feeds. Google is using all of these techniques right now, and they know who the undecided voters are. And I'm so glad you mentioned the couch, getting off the couch, because in 2012, Facebook did a study, which is very unethical in my opinion, in which, oh no, they published a study in 2012, but in the 2010 midterm elections, Facebook sent go vote reminders on election day in the midterm to 60 million of its users. And they very cleverly were able to calculate the impact of those go vote reminders that they sent out on election day. And they got 340,000 more people to get off the couch and go vote who otherwise would have stayed home. So that's what I'm trying to tell you here, is that, in fact, in Israel, there's a study a couple of years ago that showed something like in one recent election, there's something like 10 or 20% of the people who walked into the voting booths in Israel still hadn't made up their minds. So there are going to be people who can still be influenced even when they're walking into the polling place. There's still people who can be influenced, and Google knows who they are. That's the problem, and Google has access to all these powerful techniques which we cannot counteract. See, if you as a Trump supporter, you buy a billboard for Trump, I can buy 2 billboards and put them across the street and they would be for Harris. You see, that's competitive. That's competitive. But when Google is using these techniques to shift votes, you can't even see what they're doing, generally speaking, and you can't counteract what they're doing. For example, if they put go vote reminders in a partisan way on their homepage, you can't counteract that. You can't put anything on their homepage. Now, some of the people I work with in Congress and some of the attorneys general that I work with in different states, they believe that what Google is doing violates at least violates campaign finance laws, because what they're doing is making enormous in-kind contributions without declaring them. Now, Google would say, yeah, but they don't cost us anything. I mean, they're doing
No,
these
that
massive
doesn't work.
manipulations.
That doesn't work. Google, that's a bad argument. Let me tell you, when I
Right.
introduce my scenario, the reason I'm doing it is not because I don't consider your research to be probably, oh, I don't know, there's so many crazy things going on right now, but probably the single most important research being done today, because there are certain uh, key events or behaviors in a society that ripple out and touch massive or almost everything, virtually everything. And once you take our franchise from us, which is what the open border program, not accident, but program is for, is to counteract one American's vote with the non-Americans vote. And we know how that's going to go. Um, but your research is affecting everything in a pool. The ripples, it's going to hit all the shores. And so I only bring it up because, as I said, we need to have hope, and we have to know that since we're up against a foe that cannot be beaten in an algorithm. We can't just whip that up and finish it off. We can identify it, and we can physically do more hard work in those states to attempt to over this one time. And this is my next point, or my continuation. This this election, to me, and I think to many, many Americans, is the last free election, unless I know that. Well, I'm not going to keep bringing up the contrast between your voting record and your preferences and mine. I'll just speak more directly than that. The issue is this: that Elon Musk, RFK, Vivek Ramaswamy, Tulsi Gabbard, all, and 95% of all America First type voters want what you have. Well, you have the information that shows one entity or a group of elite entities that can disenfranchise all Americans in a sense, but primarily those who are in my way of thinking. Okay. The America First camp, Republicans, which 15 years ago were not the same party as they are today. And so if Donald J. Trump, J.D. Vance, and the Avengers that are with him, Elon Musk and RFK Jr., are elected to office, this will be addressed. I got to tell you, I was very upset with the first Trump administration because I thought when he was elected, and I was not an early believer in a Trump election or as president, if they don't immediately start working on one or two things, they're going to lose the next one. I said that 2000 I went to his inauguration. I said that to myself, my husband, and others. He will lose it if they don't deal with the election integrity or election fraud issue. It's over. And there was another one. I won't go into that. And it happened. Now, you're talking about an election fraud that it is not new, wasn't new in our minds in 2020, but you have sharpened the pencil, you have underscored, highlighted, and you have massively, massively improved the data collection, the analysis. You have constructed, I would say, you're at the genesis stage of something that in a few years, if properly funded, and this I would say to everybody watching this, that you need to be financially supporting his work. And I hope by the end or even now we go into that. But you have built something that, let me just use a kind of a weird example. Long, long time ago in the Jurassic Age, when there was no Google, there was a Google being built. And even Google at that time did not know where they would be today or in 2012. You don't know where your systems that I think inoculate and are preventative um, can be if you get the proper funding under the right administration. So I don't want to talk politics with you, but I will say this. I know that your research and your project would be supported in this next 4 years if he gains office. So tell us about what your project does. You've given us the bare bones, but how can it overcome the most powerful company in the world besides BlackRock? And they're probably owned by the same people.
Well, they definitely work together. So yeah, they're part of one. They're part of what Mike Benz calls the blob. So the blob is what he calls it. Uh, the uh, the idea here was beautifully expressed 100 years ago by, I believe, the first Jewish Supreme Court justice, and that's Louis Brandeis, after whom Brandeis University, which I went to briefly, was named. And Brandeis said 100 years ago that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And he said, by the way, because I went back and read his original article, that policemen are the best, I'm sorry, that street lamps, he said, are the best policemen. So same idea. The idea is that if you want to take on some bad guys, what you should do is shine a light on doing and record what they're doing. And then if they and let them know, by the way, that you are shining the light
Yeah.
and that you
We're
are
talking to
recording
you,
them. And guess
Google.
what?
We're talking to
They're
you.
not going to mess with your house. Yeah, they're not going to go to your business. No, not if the lights are on them, spotlight, and everything's being recorded. They're not going to go to your business. They're going to leave you alone. And that's where the power is of a monitoring system, a large-scale nationwide monitoring system running 24 hours a day, protecting not just our elections, but how about the content that they're sending to our children? So if you go to americasdigitalshield.com, which is our dashboard for our monitoring system, you will see content will literally make you sick to your stomach. And that's content that they're sending, that they're recommending and sending to our kids.
Oh, I've been to
And
your
this is content
website.
that's
I know
extreme.
it well.
Oh,
Absolutely. Everybody needs to go to that website and go back to it and see
well,
updates.
that's the concept here. So we're working with parenting groups, election integrity groups, AGs around the country, some members of Congress. And the bigger the system is, the bigger it is, the more power it has to stop these companies. It's not just Google, they're the worst offender, but it's not just Google. But the bigger the system is, the more power it has to just stop them. They're not going to, are you crazy? They're not going to go mess with our house when we've got spotlights on them and we're recording everything. They're not going to do it. And we have gotten them to back down a couple of times on certain things. But the bigger our system is, the more power it has. Now, there's some problems there. One is that the bigger the system is, the more of a threat it poses to them. And that means they're going to take steps to try to stop us, and they have taken steps to try to stop us. So doing what we're doing is a little bit scary, just like FK Jr. doing what he does is a little bit scary. And what we do is a little bit scary, I have to tell you that. And I think, we have paid some prices already. There have been 6 incidents now involving some degree of violence, involving people either very close to me or people who work for me. And the first one has really, uh, in some respects, has just destroyed my life, because the first incident took place in 2019, not long after I first testified before Congress. And that summer, 2019, I also gave a private briefing for Ken Paxton, who's the AG of Texas and has the largest attorney general office in the country, more than 800 attorneys. I've been meeting with him and his staff regularly. But I gave a briefing for a bunch of AGs. This was with Paxton in charge. And I told them what was going on. I told them what our findings were. They were very strong findings even back then. And then I went out in the hall. And then a few minutes later, one of the AGs came out into the hall, came up to me, and he said, Dr. Epstein, I don't mean to scare you. He said, but based on what you told us, he said, I predict that you're going to be killed in some sort of accident in the next few months. And then he walked away. He's still an AG, by the way. And it wasn't Paxton, it was someone else. The point is, I wasn't killed, obviously, because I'm still here, but my wife was. A few months later, she was killed in a horrendous car accident. And her vehicle was never examined forensically, and it disappeared. It was somehow ended up with a junk dealer in Mexico, I was told. And that was that was that was my property, and it disappeared from the impound yard. So I will never really know what happened there, but there have been 5 more incidents since then. I'll tell you one quickly here, which I don't think I've ever said this publicly, but a few months ago, data stopped flowing into our monitoring system. So I called up, it was 11 o'clock at night, I called up some of the tech people. I couldn't really reach people. I finally called my son, because he helps us on some tech things. And he said, "Don't worry, Dad. I'll drive to the office because we have a special office. I don't even know where it is, but we have a special office which have our most important equipment. And I'll go there and see if there's anything there." And I said, "Great, thank you so much. Sorry to bother you at 11 o'clock at night." As of midnight, I hadn't heard back from him, but he finally called and he said, "Well, Dad, I'm so sorry I didn't make it to the office." I said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, on the way there," he said, "my car got broadsided by a black vehicle." He said, "which then pulled away and drove off high speed." I said, "Are you okay?" He said, "Don't worry, I'm not badly hurt." He said, "But that's what happened. That's why I didn't get to the office." That was the fifth incident. So what we're doing is it's important for our kids, to protect our kids. It's important for our democracy, but it is a little bit scary because just like the work that RFK Jr. does, because we are a threat to probably the biggest, the most powerful company that has ever existed.
What you're saying is very real. And I've talked to people in my conversations here about the fact that Americans suffer from "it can't happen hereism," right? You can go to any other country and someone can be killed by a corporate entity. Someone could be killed by the political powers that be. You could even go to somebody like France or Great Britain or something. Americans think it can happen there, even to what some might call and some may not liberal democracies, the West, right? Doesn't have to be Saudi Arabia, Russia, or China, but it can't happen hereism. So no matter what, when you say that, the only people who will believe you immediately are people like myself who don't have that virus of "it can't happen hereism." I don't believe that um, when you go into government, you immediately become sanctified and holy and would never do anything wrong, like target an individual for an execution or assassination. That's absurd, but that's that mindset that is there. So yeah, it can happen. Heroism, it can happen is the truth, and it does happen. And many people have over the years been assassinated either by corporate entities or government entities. So let's get over that, right? It's the truth. And the weird thing is that the left, which I'm not part of, my husband used to be a radical Marxist, Maoist type when he was, I don't know, probably into his early 20s. But the left does think that corporate and the military industrial complex and CIA, that kind of thing, black ops, do things like that, but if not now. Like, in other words, these agencies don't do these wrong things now. Like the Justice Department is now honest Abes, they're all honest Abes. And a corporation like Google would never assassinate somebody or have someone assassinated. And that's a pretty weird double standard because Google has the power, the reach, the money to assassinate anybody it wants, and it will never look like that. And so, yeah, what you're going through, you're putting your life at risk, and I will add you to my prayer list because I pray for the people that I believe are at risk right now in this election, and you're definitely one of them.
Well, it's very hard doing what we do, but on the other hand, I have a wonderful staff. I have young people who come from all over the country to work with me, especially in the summer. We had 26 interns this summer from all over. Yeah, and these are wicked smart people who really believe in what we're doing here. Uh, but it's tough. On the other hand, we also do really good science. We make wonderful discoveries. We present at scientific meetings, and we publish in peer-reviewed journals. So the work we're doing is very rigorous scientifically. We keep making new discoveries, which is tremendously exciting. Unfortunately, what we're discovering more and more is that companies like Google have unprecedented power to uh, influence people to really, especially if they're undecided. That's the key. If they can be influenced, Google, they have the tools now to just push people one way or the other without anyone knowing what they're doing. So that's another reason why building monitoring systems is so important, because that creates a paper trail. That's very important. In 2018, there was a leak of emails from Google to the Wall Street Journal, to a reporter named John McKinnon. And in these emails, Google employees are discussing how can we use ephemeral experiences. I'll define that in a second. How can we use ephemeral experiences to change people's views about Trump's travel ban? So when I saw that, my head just spun. I couldn't believe it, because that leaked in 2018. Since 2013, my team and I had been studying how Google might be able to use ephemeral
Ephemeral data.
experiences
Yeah,
to change
experiences.
people's. Exactly. That's exactly what we had been studying, but I had never used that phrase
And that
before. I had
stuff
never
just
even
goes
seen the
out
phrase.
there and it's gone and there's no record of it. It just pops onto screen. What does that look like normally?
Well, it can be something as simple as those search suggestions. When you start to type a search term, you are being manipulated from the first character that you type. And by the way, if you doubt that, and I did this when I testified before Congress the first time. I told this to Senator Cruz, Ted Cruz, and he pulled out his cell phone. He said, well, what do I type? I said, well, first of all, go to google.com. Never do that again. I said, this will be the last time you ever go to google.com. I said, in the search bar, just type the letter A. So he did. And I said, so what have you got? And he says, well, I've got, I think he said, I got 5 suggestions that have just appeared on my screen. And I said, and what are they? He said, well, I think he said 3 or 4 of them were for Amazon. I said, well, you weren't trying to go to Amazon, were you? He goes, no. I said, well, do you know why they're trying to get you to go to Amazon? Because Amazon is Google's largest advertiser, and Google is Amazon's single largest source of traffic. These are business partners. So their search suggestions are ephemeral. They appear, they influence people, they disappear, they're gone forever. There's no record of them, except now our monitoring system is capturing them by the millions. See, we're creating a paper trail. Then there's the search results down below. Well, those have tremendous power to shift people's thinking, because people trust what's at the top. So Google puts content at the top that they want people to see. And if they don't want people to see content, they suppress it, they demote it, they delete it. Yeah.
When we started our company, we're the founding father of independent online journalism. 1997 is when we
Wow.
started. Nobody else was there. The Drudge Report was there, but he wasn't a journalist. So we started. My husband's um, he's a journalist. He ran the Sacramento Union, the LA Herald Examiner when he was young, right? And he knew newspapers and $2 million printing presses and fleets of delivery trucks were going away back in 1995. Really, he started saying that. So what happened? We started WorldNetDaily. Um, and people went berserk because they had never experienced what we were doing. We were actually putting out news that didn't look anything like any of the major newspapers out
Sure.
there. And nobody had ever seen that. Like, what was this WorldNet Daily thing? And I used to give little interviews and say things and write things and say, it's a level playing field for the first time in journalistic history.
Hmm.
There will no longer be any speed bumps or block walls to the independent journalists. Everything from this moment on changes forever. We have reached this point where blah, 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 blah. I didn't know the word Google at the time. I would say I'm probably not the only one who wished that there was a prophet that came and said, by the way, because I would have prepared for what happened. We built a publishing company with New York Times bestsellers. We were producing videos, millions people selling them, millions of them, not giving them away. Um, we had a massive news organization and a store. Obama comes into office. You mentioned 2012. Suddenly, because we had been going after Obama for 4 years, suddenly something hit. I will tell you where we were. In Google search terms, when you go to news, WorldNetDaily was on that tab. WorldNetDaily.com was on their news tab. They actually had us there at some point. And we would always, if you searched a news story, assassination attempt, our story would be on the front page, somewhere on the front page, top three, usually four. It stopped. So all of our revenue models, our entire business model was destroyed because we got on Google's radar and they started to do the testing in real time. And so I know exactly, if I could go back and have 1,000 searches that I had the screenshot, WorldNet Daily's right there. I don't have that proof, but I suspect the Obama administration in collusion with Google, because they were meeting so much at that time, might have something to do with it.
Oh, Obama's second. I know all about this because I know all about. I've just been writing about it actually about the tech team that helped Obama win that second election. That was supervised by the head of Google. I just have been writing about this recently. I even have a photograph of Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, with all the members of all the nerds on Obama's tech team. And one of those nerds actually made a terrible mistake and answered a question from a reporter who asked how many of the points by which Obama won, which was 4 points, 5 million votes, how many of the points came from your tech team? And he said, 2. And then he realized he had made a terrible mistake, and he said, well, at most. So he actually said 2 of those points, that's 2.5 million votes, came from the tech team because they were working with Google. That's why. 2012, 2013, that's the transition. That's when everything changed because 2013, Obama's second term, 7 federal agencies were being headed by former Google executives. Obama's chief technology officer, former Google executive. Stephanie Hannon was Hillary Clinton's chief technology officer, former Google executive. But let me just say, if anyone out there wants to help us, I can tell you that we're about to run out of money. We may not even make it until the election. To make sure we get through the election, we only need an additional $250,000. But that we need immediately to set this up as a permanent system, which this country must have. Because if you have no monitoring system, you don't know what's going on. You don't
That's
know
the
what they're
key,
doing.
your monitoring system, because what legislation can't do as well, a monitoring system can. And we need to talk about that when you come back.
Well, exactly, because you can go back in time a year and you can see all of the ephemeral content that these companies, Google and YouTube and Facebook and other
And that's
companies,
usable in a
you can
court of
actually,
law. That's usable in a
of
court of law.
course, well, the whole thing to make this permanent for this country is $50 million, which sounds like a lot, but that's
No,
just a
it
couple
doesn't.
of
It sounds
television
like chump
commercials.
change. That's the whole enchilada, $50 million.
I have to tell you that a very nice, wonderful person whose first name is Nina, I won't say her last name, in New York had set up for me a wonderful luncheon with some very, very wealthy people trying to help us with funds. And we did get some funds from that. That was over a year ago. And one of the people there was a very wealthy man named Katsamatides, who owns a bunch of supermarket chains in New York and also owns WABC in New York. And he said, when I said $50 million, he says, $50 million. He goes, that's chump change. He
I
said,
just said the
especially
same
given all
thing.
that's what exactly what he said. He says chump change. He said,
It
but
is.
if I were Google, he said, I would just take care of you. He said, I would hire someone and that person would hire someone else. He said, and I would just take